Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Bates, and you've reached the Rabbit Room Apologetics podcast. Thanks for joining us. So, last time we finished up with, in our view, the 10 obstacles to interpretation. Number 2, which was precedent of other interpreters. That's us relying too much on other interpreters, including our tradition and other things, and how these potentially blind us when we are trying to be our own interpreter. So next, we're going to number 3. And I've got number 3 laid out here. Okay? And this is the modern, or the reader's context in modern anachronism. Now, anachronism is putting things out of time order, right? i.e., projecting the present into the past. And so the point is, many times when we're reading an ancient text, and the Bible is an ancient text, right? The author does not necessarily know everything that we know from our modern point of view. And they're not writing it to a modern audience. They're writing it to an audience of their peers, typically, who can read and understand their points of view. So, for example, if I were writing a story for consumption by Americans in the current time, and I wanted to talk about how people get their expectations built up for something big, and then they get let down, I could say, it was like the Super Bowl, where we had two teams, and within a few minutes you knew that one team was going to lose, and they lost. I mean, the entire game was long, and it didn't take very long, and they played out the entire game, but it didn't take long for us to figure out who was going to win that game, right? And that was a letdown for people who wanted to see a good game, let alone the fans. Well, guess what? In a couple of years, you may not know which Super Bowl I'm talking about, because there probably are several that fit that bill, even in the past. I can think of a couple. The other one is you may not be familiar with football, so you may not even know about the Super Bowl. So you got to keep who the person's audience is, right? And so when you're interpreting the Bible, always keep in mind the audience that the author is writing to, because he's going to be writing to that audience specifically. And while God certainly can help put things in there, it makes no sense for a Moses or one of the prophets or a Paul or one of the evangelists writing the words of Christ to put in references that make absolutely no sense, right? What good would it be for Moses to write in his text? Oh, and God created the world. And there was this thing called the Big Bang, where everything came into a singularity and exploded, but it really wasn't an explosion. It was just an expansion of cosmic matter. And it's like, he's writing nonsense to those people, right? People in the time of Moses would have no idea what that was. And it would only make sense to us after we had a Big Bang. And it's like, you can't put stuff into there, right? I think we all know this, but we do this a great deal. And one of the ones who and I'm going to be sorry here if I am making this an attack on the reformers. I don't. They were brilliant men. They had a tough situation where things were going on within the church that they were part of that they needed to correct in many different ways, and people make mistakes. But Luther was writing a bunch of his stuff with the idea of fighting the Roman Catholic Church. And so his interpretations of Galatians, his interpretation of Romans from the Pauline perspective, his interpretation of a lot of the Old Testament text was seen in his mind as this battle with Rome And he filtered a lot of it through that. And people who were living through the beginning of the Reformation with him probably understood this very well. But today, we may not understand it as well as they did. And we certainly can say that that was not the point of the original authors, right? That they were not considering this break between the traditions of Rome and stuff. But we certainly see a lot of human traditions coming into play with the believers. And Christ has a lot to say about that, as well as Paul. So, keeping that in mind, we want to take our context out of it. We want to not fall into this trap of anachronism, of trying to force feed modern stuff into the text. Okay? So, when you think about the ancient writers, the ancient authors lived with the different metaphysical assumptions, different cosmologies, different assumptions about divine agency, different social structures, right? And so we can't impose modern stuff onto them, right? Here's a great example. And you saw me open up with this one, which is Job 41. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up in the Net Bible, just so we get the whole thing. Can you pull in Leviathan with a hook and tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? And this continues. And this is from the book of Job, right? And we can see here, who is Leviathan? Well, Leviathan is, and if I go over here where I can get the English, that is actually a transliteration of the Hebrew word, right? Leviathan. So Leviathan would be the English transliteration of it. They did a Greek transliteration of it. And if we look up the word here, it occurs 6 times, and it talks about a sea monster potentially, right? And okay, so that's some interesting information. Let's go ahead and look at the theological workbook of the Old Testament and see what it says. And here, and let me move my face out of the way here. Sorry. Leviathan was a large aquatic animal. Maybe a crocodile. I don't think so. Maybe a serpent. Maybe a whale. That's our modern stuff getting in the way. Okay? Now, if we look back at the ancient Near East, the idea of giant sea creatures in the deep, right? And the deep was this place of chaos. And so that's why the deep was a big part of the Hebrew worldview that Moses was trying to work through, right? Then we can say, well, it's not a crocodile. It's not a sea serpent or a whale, something that people could see in the ocean. This was something big. This was something chaotic. This was something terrifying. Okay? And so, let's see, what did the Net Bible guys say here? Okay, so they go a little bit further back here, and they're talking about Nakash means to extract from the water to fish, right? And Shaka means to cause to sink, to tie and bind. And so that's where we get this idea. Can you pull Leviathan in with a hook, right? Can you tie it down with its tongue with a rope? And so these are all Hebrew words talking about tying it up and pulling it out of the water, fishing it. So we can see that here, right? Don't pull your modern thoughts into this. Don't try to demystify the Bible. When you're trying to do a interpretation of your own, take this as the original audience would have taken it. Step out a little bit. It may be a little difficult. It may be uncomfortable. But step out a little bit and take it as the original audience would have. And keep it in their mindset. Leviathan, it's giant sea creatures in the deep. Very scary, very chaotic things. That was a big part of who the ancient Hebrews were. The other one they talk about here is Psalm 74, right? So let's look at Psalm 74 and see what we have from that, right? And here's this is a good one. This is a maskil of Asaph, and this is a musical or liturgical term, right? It says this is a song of Asaph. So this is not written by David. This is written by Asaph, who's the chief musician. Oh God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Interesting wording here. So what I like is, let's look at the word anger, right? And you can see here where we're dealing here with this idea of nostril and face, right? Now, very important when you're reading a Hebrew text, okay? And this is a perfect example. We translate this into anger, right? And you can see there are other places that are marked here where they have anger. But if you look at one of the text resources I use quite a bit, the Theological Workbook of the Old Testament, there are times like I did just previously, I say, this is garbage, right? This it was a crocodile. No, Leviathan was not a crocodile. But we talk about nostril, face, and anger. So one thing about the Hebrew language is that Hebrew is a very physical language, right? They don't use a lot of abstract ideas, right? We use this. Greek has a lot of this. So anger is a very abstract idea. It's emotions, it's actions, it's all kinds of things all rolled into one, right? In Hebrew, it's literally your nostrils are flaring, or your face is showing the anger, right? That's the physical reality of what they're dealing with. The other thing is one of those famous ones in the book of Daniel, or a finger of God is at the banquet of the last king that Daniel served under, was writing on the wall and says, "You have been judged," right, and found not worthy. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit there. It says that he was fearful, right, in some of the English translations. Well, what it really says in the Hebrew is that his bowels were loosened. He was so scared that he pooped in his pants, okay? That's scared, okay? So anger, being afraid is very abstract. You don't sense that as much as he pooped in his pants. That's really scary, right? When they talk about heartbreak, and we talk about heartbreak, we're trying to get a physical sense. Well, in Hebrew, when you are depressed, your stomach and your liver are feeling bad, right? Because you feel it deep down here, right? We've all had that where we've had something happen and a loved one died, or maybe we were rejected or something, right? You feel it deep down. And in Hebrew is a very physical language. And that goes right back. So now, rethink the lessons I had on Genesis 1. Because I always start there with everybody. And we were talking about Erev and Boker, right? Evening and morning, right? And who starts the tomorrow with evening, right? No one. When I'm talking to you in everyday language, I'm going, hey, I'll meet you tomorrow. I'm talking about after the sun goes down, sun comes up, right? That's tomorrow. Okay? But we don't say evening and morning, right? Tomorrow is a known entity. But Hebrew being a very physical language and a language of shepherds, well, evening, think about it. You're out in the field. It's dark, right? And as it's getting darker, you stop seeing stuff in the distance very cleanly, right? And you start things get less distinct and it becomes more chaotic, right? You can get a sense of dread, right? Things can get so dark, especially when you're not around electrical lights and such. And then morning, right? Sun comes up and light starts coming in and starts filtering in. And as the light grows and grows, things in the distance become cleaner to see. They become clearer. They become more distinct, right? Order. And so the first sections of Genesis, the 7 days, Erev, Boker, evening, morning, is not a timekeeping on a daily basis. I mean, like I pointed out in the study, right? You don't even have the sun and moon for a while, right? But you have this idea of, if you're a Hebrew thinker and you are used to being out in the field, oh yeah, evening is when it gets chaotic and it's scary when you can't see beyond the firelight, right? What's out there? There's strange noises out there, right? And that's chaos or chaotic environment, right? And order is, oh, I can see more. I don't, nothing's lost in the shadows. I can feel more comfortable, right? And so God takes the world in Genesis 1, right, through 7 steps of going from a more chaotic, less orderly, to a more ordered world. And he does this in 7 steps because he wants to. And God has a reason for that. And that has to deal with the Sabbath and all kinds of other issues. But the idea is that God writes a theological presentation. And who was the original audience for Genesis? Well, these are the children of Israel coming out of Egypt after 400 years of slavery under a pagan god. And there were multiples, right? Because the children of Israel were there, and then there were other kingdoms that came in and conquered Egypt, or other rulers came in from other areas, right? There were a lot of different pagan influences that they were forced to live under. And so God's resetting them. He's, with Genesis 1, he's saying, no. There's not this idea of that I had to fight with chaos. I just ordered it. I just spoke it into existence, right? And that's very different from the ancient Near Eastern other stories of creation. And I gave you this order in very timely and orderly. I'm a God of order, right? And he does that. So keep that in mind. The original audience did not know the cosmology that we have currently in the modern world. Their cosmology was very different. And this speaks to their cosmology, but it also is a polemic against the pagan cosmologies. Because one of the big things in Genesis 1 is God made man in his image. He made Adam, mankind, in his image. And to be in his image is to be his image bearer, to be his representative, right? And we covered this in the Genesis exposition, where it means that there's no royalty. There's no one between you and God, right? There's no royal figure who interceded between you and God. God created us to be his image bearers, to be his representatives. So that's very important for us to remember that. And that's all part of this idea of doing the interpretation properly. Okay? So we talked about the example. We talked about the point. There are other voices. John Walton. I love John Walton's work here, The Lost World of Genesis 1. Okay? Let me go ahead and move my face out of the way. And John Walton argues that Genesis 1 functions within ancient cosmological categories. I learned a great deal when I first picked up John Walton's book here and saw him talk on it. So this is a very important one. This is one I would suggest you think about getting. The Lost World of Genesis 1, if you really want to explore, right, ways of thinking about how God created the world? Okay, so practical steps for you. Learn the relevant cultural and religious background, especially Second Temple Judaism, because we do know that there was some redaction and some other work done in the Second Temple period to the text, and so they were written with the Second Temple period Judaism or earlier mindset, right? Don't use a modern mindset. Think of it in Jewish terms as well, right? Don't force feed Christianity into it. There's plenty of Christianity in the Jewish text, and when I have debates with rabbis, I always point that out. But don't be afraid to say, okay, we got to look at this a little Jewish, right? And remember, especially here with the Hebrew text, you're dealing with A&E, ancient Near Eastern mythologies, and Paul does this a lot. Paul has to deal with the fact that the Roman gods, the Greco-Roman gods, right, are a big part of the context that everyone's going to have, especially the Gentiles. So keep that in mind. Replace modern category questions, is this scientifically true, with ancient category questions. What does this mean to an Israelite or to a Hebrew, right? That's important when you're doing your interpretation. And test interpretive options against ancient parallels and the canonical witnesses, right? Always go back, test it against Scripture. Don't come up with an interpretation that would be contrary to Scripture. Don't say, oh, well, Genesis 1, right, clearly points to the fact that there are, multiple gods, and that God is not monotheistic, and that God had a brother, and so on and so on, right? Make sure you always test against that, right? All right. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that's opening up some thoughts on how you're interpreting the Bible, how you can enhance and expand how you're talking with God yourself. If you haven't thought about it, please think about liking and subscribing to the channel, liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us a great deal. Share it with a friend. Nothing helps Bible study than having a Bible study partner who can question you and say, okay, let's talk about that point. Maybe you didn't quite get that point. And let's work through some of these things. And let's remember some of these things that Mark is feeding us here, right? And so do that, right? And have a Bible study partner. And this is not my interpretations that I want you to get. Remember, these are rules of theology, rules of hermeneutics, so that you can do your interpretation. I want you to become so comfortable with how to do this, no matter what level you have in reading the Hebrew, no matter how much knowledge you pick up about the ancient Near East and about Second Temple period and about Roman history and stuff. There's always more you can pick up. But at whatever level you're at, you can interpret the biblical text and get closer to God. And I want you to get closer to God. I want you to be so comfortable with it that you feel comfortable talking to people about God, right? And that's the whole role of apologetics, is to be comfortable talking to people about God and answering their questions. And every believer, right, Peter tells us, every believer should have a rational and reasonable answer for God, to God, for others. And I want you to be prepared for that. All right? So, leave comments, leave questions. Let me know what you're thinking about. Have a great day. Be blessed. And remember, God is good all the time. Thank you.